They said the mission was impossible. She came back with the answer. The door was already closing behind her when she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a voice, somewhere behind the heavy wood panel, saying the words that men in rooms like that had been saying about women like her for decades. She won't last the year. And then a small, polished laugh. Hayat did not stop walking. She did not slow her pace. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and she walked the full length of that corridor in the Ministry of Higher Education building in Jeddah, with her heels clicking on marble floors that had never once been walked on by a woman who intended to stay. It was the year 2000. She was 26 years old. She had just come back from 3 years in England, where she had completed her undergraduate degree in pharmacology at King's College London, while almost every person she knew back home, friends, distant relatives, the man at the post office who remembered her father, had waited politely for her to give up and come home. She hadn't. She had walked into laboratories that smelled of chemicals and possibility, and she had learned things that felt, at the time, like pulling light into her hands. But England was England, and Jeddah was Jeddah, and the corridor she was walking down now was the specific junction between those two worlds, the place where what she had become met the wall of what she was expected to remain. She pushed through the glass door at the end of the corridor and stepped into the afternoon sun. The city was loud and warm and entirely indifferent to her. A car horn, a vendor calling from a cart, a child running ahead of his mother across the street. The world continuing its regular business, while inside her chest, something had gone very quiet and very hard, the way metal goes hard when it has been through enough heat. She had come to the ministry that day to submit her application for a research fellowship. The fellowship would fund her return to England for a doctorate program at Cambridge. It was the kind of opportunity that arrived once, if it arrived at all. The committee had received her application 3 weeks earlier, and today was the day they had asked her to appear in person to answer questions. The questions had not been about science. They had been about her father's opinion, about whether she had a guardian who approved of this plan, about what she intended to do with a doctorate, specifically, and whether she had considered that the journey from advanced education to practical employment was, for a woman in her position, longer than she might expect. She had answered every question, calmly, fully, in complete sentences. She had not let her voice rise, or her eyes drop. She had given them nothing to use against her, except the quality of her answers, which were very good, and which they had written down slowly, as though surprised that her words could be turned into sentences that made sense. Then they had asked her to wait outside while they discussed. She had waited for 32 minutes. She had counted ceiling tiles, 47 of them, plain white, arranged in a grid above a row of chairs that were upholstered in a green, that had been fashionable once, and was now simply tired. She had sat in the third chair from the left, and thought about a woman she had read about in a book when she was 11 years old, Marie Curie, who had been refused entry to the University of Warsaw simply because she was a woman, and who had consequently gotten on a train to Paris and won 2 Nobel Prizes. Hayat was not thinking about Nobel Prizes. She was thinking about the train. When the door opened again, a man in a gray suit appeared and told her that her application had been accepted with conditions. The conditions were not scientific. They were administrative, which was the polite word the ministry used for limitations it did not wish to justify. She would receive the fellowship. She would go to Cambridge. She would complete her doctorate in biotechnology. But she would be expected to return to Saudi Arabia upon completion and to direct her research toward applications the committee deemed relevant to national priorities. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, standard. But the way he said it, with a specific flatness, a bureaucratic weight, made her understand that what they were really saying was, "We are giving you a very long leash, and we expect you to know it is a leash." She thanked him. She took the letter. She walked back down the corridor with the same pace she had walked it the first time. Outside, she found a bench near a small garden and sat down. She put the letter on her knee and looked at it for a long time. The paper was crisp and official and embossed at the top with seals that meant authority. She had gotten what she came for. The door had opened. And yet the voice behind the closing door, the small polished laugh, the 32 minutes and 47 ceiling tiles, all of it had settled into her the way sand settles into stone, not on the surface but inside it, reshaping it from within. She thought about her mother, who had raised her in a house full of books, and had told her, repeatedly, from the time Hayat was old enough to understand the word, knowledge is the only thing nobody can take back from you once you have it. Her mother had not gone to university. Her mother had not been given the option. But she had made sure, through small deliberate acts of will, that her daughter had options her own mother could not have imagined. Hayat folded the letter and placed it in her bag. She was going to Cambridge. She was going to do the work. And whatever the committee had imagined for her future, the narrow lane, the managed ambitions, the leash, she was going to be very polite about disregarding all of it. She stood up from the bench. The afternoon sun had shifted. The city was still loud. The vendor was still calling from his cart. The child who had been running was now gone, absorbed somewhere into the ordinary motion of the street, and the world continued its business without ceremony or announcement. She started walking. She did not look back at the ministry building. She already knew what was behind her. Cambridge in January is a city that tests you before you even get to the laboratory. The cold comes off the fens like something with a personal grievance, wet and specific and seemingly aimed. The streets are beautiful and ancient, and entirely indifferent to the comfort of human beings who are not wearing 3 layers. The colleges rise along the river in stone faces that have been watching people arrive and try and fail, and occasionally succeed for the better part of 1,000 years. They do not look impressed. Hayat arrived in the second week of January 2001, carrying 2 suitcases, a carry-on bag full of research papers she had marked up during the flight, and a specific kind of quiet determination that people who had never seen it before sometimes mistook for shyness. She was 27 years old. She was enrolled in the doctoral program in biotechnology at Cambridge's Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology. Her supervisor was a man named Dr. Owen Clark, a gentle, precise Welshman in his late 50s, who had the habit of removing his glasses and cleaning them when he was thinking, and who had, in 30 years of teaching, seen approximately 4 students arrive with the quality of focus that Hayat brought to her first meeting with him. He did not say this to her. He thought it, and then he asked her about her research interests, and she talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and he cleaned his glasses twice, and when she finished, he said simply, "Right, let's get you a bench." Her research area was biosensors, devices that could detect biological and chemical substances in the human body and provide rapid diagnostic results. The field was not new. Biosensors had existed in various forms since the 1960s. The glucose monitor used by people with diabetes was a biosensor. But what Hayat was interested in was something different, a biosensor that could work under conditions that most of the world actually lived under, rather than the conditions that most research laboratories assumed. She had grown up reading medical journals alongside novels, and what had struck her, somewhere around age 15, was the gap between what science could do and where science was willing to go. Diagnostic technology in 2001 was sophisticated and advancing rapidly, but almost all of it required equipment that plugged into walls, reagents that had to be kept cold, trained technicians to operate machines, and laboratory infrastructure that was simply absent in vast stretches of Africa, South Asia, and the rural Middle East. The people who needed diagnostics most urgently were also the people for whom the available diagnostics were least accessible. This was not a new observation. Aid organizations had been making it for decades. What was missing was not the observation but the solution, a diagnostic tool that could be manufactured cheaply, stored without refrigeration, used by someone with minimal training, and trusted to produce accurate results in a field setting. Dr. Clark listened to her articulate this problem in their second meeting, and said, without any particular drama, that she was describing something the field had been calling impossible for 20 years. She said she knew. He cleaned his glasses. She began. The first year was almost entirely failure, which is the correct foundation for work that has not been done before. She learned the shape of the problem by learning every way it could not be solved. She worked with acoustic wave biosensors, with optical fiber configurations, with piezoelectric materials that changed their electrical properties under mechanical stress. Each approach had a version that worked in controlled laboratory conditions, and fell apart in the field conditions she was simulating. Fluctuating temperatures, humidity, the kind of biological samples you collected from people who were not sitting calmly in air-conditioned clinics. Her bench in the laboratory was the third from the left in a row of 6. She shared the lab with 5 other doctoral students, all of whom were working on problems that were more tractable than hers and all of whom, to their credit, never said so directly. There was a man named Colin who worked on protein folding and who brought in good biscuits on Fridays and who once, at 2 in the morning, sat across from her during a stretch of failed experiments and said, "The thing about an impossible problem is that it isn't actually impossible, it just requires a different angle." He said it the way people say things when they don't know what else to offer. She wrote it down anyway. She had the habit of writing things down. She kept a notebook, black cover, plain pages, in which she recorded not just data but everything. Observations, questions, failed theories, things people said that seemed worth keeping, shopping lists, phrases in Arabic that had no English equivalent, the names of places she intended to go someday. The notebook was not a journal. It was more like a working surface for her thinking, a place where the inside of her mind could sit outside for a while and be examined. In the second year, her research shifted toward acoustic resonance biosensors, devices that used sound waves at the microscopic level to detect the presence of specific biological molecules. The principle was elegant: coat a tiny crystal surface with a substance that attracted only one type of molecule, let the crystal vibrate, and measure the change in vibration frequency when the target molecule bound to the surface. The mass change altered the frequency. The frequency change could be measured. The measurement told you whether the molecule was present. On paper, it worked. In the laboratory, with good equipment and stable conditions, it worked. The problem was precision at low concentrations, detecting trace amounts of a pathogen in a real biological sample, where everything was also present at once, where the sample was messy and variable, and nothing sat still. She spent 6 months on this problem specifically. She tried 17 different surface coatings. She tried different crystal geometries. She tried modifying the way the signal was processed electronically. On her notebook page for the 14th attempted configuration, she wrote, "Still not sensitive enough, but warmer." Warmer was not a scientific term. It was something she had learned to trust, that intuition about proximity, about being closer to right without yet being right. Scientists were not supposed to trust feelings, but the ones who did the hardest work usually had this: a sense of the shape of the answer before they had found it, a conviction they could not justify, but also could not put down. In year 2, she also met a woman named Claire Webb, who was doing postdoctoral work in a lab 2 buildings over, and who would become, over the following years, one of the people Hayat called when things were very good or very bad, which is the only category of person worth having. Claire was from Manchester, tall and practical, with a precise laugh and the ability to eat terrible cafeteria sandwiches with apparent enjoyment. She introduced Hayat to the concept of the Friday walk, a walk along the Cam every Friday afternoon regardless of weather, during which no one was allowed to talk about their research for the first 20 minutes. Hayat initially thought this was a waste of time. By the 3rd month of Friday walks, she had stopped thinking that. There was a particular stretch of the river, past the backs, where the trees came down close to the water, and the afternoon light fell through them at an angle that had no practical function whatsoever, and was simply beautiful. On the Friday walks, Hayat discovered that beauty had a scientific use. It reset something in the brain that long stretches of laboratory work compressed, some capacity for the wider perspective, for pattern recognition across a larger frame. Several of her best ideas arrived not in the laboratory, but on those Friday afternoons, when her mind had stopped working at the problem directly and had started simply moving. Her 3rd year at Cambridge was the most difficult. Not because the science was harder, though it was, but because the weight of time was accumulating. 3 years is long enough for doubt to stop being a visitor and start feeling like a resident. She had made genuine progress. The sensitivity of her sensor design had improved substantially. She had published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals. But the specific breakthrough she was working toward, a field-deployable version of the technology, stable without refrigeration, manufacturable, at a cost that made global distribution feasible, remained just beyond what her current design could deliver. In the fourth year, something shifted. She had been working on the problem of signal stability, how to make the sensor's readings consistent across a wide range of temperatures and humidity levels, which was the specific wall she had been hitting for 18 months. The standard approach was to use a reference channel alongside the active sensor channel, comparing the two to cancel out environmental interference. She had tried this. It helped, but not enough. One morning in the middle of October, she arrived at the laboratory at 7 and began reviewing data from the previous day's experiments. She was looking at the noise, the random variation in the signal that wasn't coming from the target molecule, just from the environment. She had looked at this noise many times before, but on that morning, for reasons she could not fully explain, she saw it differently. She saw not just the problem it represented, but the pattern it contained. The noise was not random. It had a frequency profile, and if it had a profile, it could be modeled, and if it could be modeled, it could be subtracted. She put down her coffee and sat very still for a moment. Then she began to work. She did not stop for 9 hours. She barely noticed the laboratory emptying around her in the late afternoon, barely noticed the light changing outside the windows, barely noticed Colin leaving and coming back with biscuits and leaving again. She was in that specific state of concentration that makes time behave differently, where the next step is always clear, and the previous step has already receded, and there is only this, only the work, only the next calculation, and the next configuration, and the next thing to test. At just past 8 in the evening, she ran the test. The sensor performed within the parameters she had been chasing for 4 years. She ran it again. Same result. She ran it a third time under artificially elevated temperature and humidity conditions, simulating the environmental extremes of a rural clinic in sub-Saharan Africa. Same result. She sat back in her chair. The laboratory was empty and lit by the particular white fluorescent light that gave everything the color of something left overnight. Her coffee from that morning was cold on the bench beside her. The notebook was open to a page covered in calculations and arrows and one small phrase in the lower right corner that she had written at some point during the 9 hours without remembering she was doing it. The phrase said, "This is it." She did not call anyone. Not that night. She closed the notebook and shut down her equipment and locked the laboratory door behind her and walked home along the river, which was dark and moving quietly, and she let the Cambridge cold do what it always did, and she thought about her mother, and about the 47 ceiling tiles, and about the man at the post office back home who had waited politely for her to give up. She had not given up. The work was not done. There was still a year of verification, refinement, trial preparation, and the specific process of turning a laboratory result into something a real human being could hold in their hand. But the answer was there. It had been in the noise all along, waiting to be seen. She went home and ate a bowl of rice and went to sleep. In the language of science, what Hayat had created was a quartz crystal microbalance biosensor, with integrated computational noise correction, surface functionalized with molecularly imprinted polymers, selected for high-specificity pathogen binding. In the language of the real world, it was a device the size of a postage stamp that a community health worker in a rural village could use, without electricity or refrigeration or a laboratory or a medical degree, to find out in 15 minutes whether the person in front of them had tuberculosis, malaria, or a blood-borne infection. These are not the same sentence, but they describe the same thing. The final year of her doctorate was the year she stopped sleeping in a straight line. Work at that stage has a texture unlike any other phase. Not the wide-open exploration of the early years, not the focused drilling of the middle ones, but a kind of running, where you are simultaneously racing against external deadlines and internal perfectionism, and the slow approach of the moment, when you will have to let the work out of your hands and into the world, where other people will read it and question it, and find the places where it can be taken apart. She ran the verification trials 26 times under different simulated conditions. She modified the surface chemistry 3 more times after what she had believed was the final version. She wrote and rewrote the methods section of her doctoral thesis until Dr. Clark, who was patient in the specific way of people who have supervised a great deal of very good work, told her that the methods section was already excellent and that her next revision was making it marginally worse. She stopped revising the methods section. Claire read every chapter and sent notes back with comments that ranged from technically precise to simply, "This is extraordinary. Stop touching it." She submitted her thesis in September 2004. The Viva, the oral examination by two senior academics who could ask her anything about anything she had written, was scheduled for November. In the weeks between submission and examination, she did something she had not allowed herself to do in 4 years. She rested. She walked along the cam without thinking about biosensors. She called her mother, who listened to her describe the completed work, and then said, in the quiet and complete way that she had, "Good. Now what?" The Viva lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. The examiners asked her 91 questions. She answered 91 questions. They asked her to wait outside. She sat in a corridor, but she did not count the ceiling tiles this time. And 12 minutes later, one of them came out and told her that her thesis had been accepted with only minor corrections. She shook his hand. She walked outside. It was a gray November afternoon, and the city was wet and cold and going about its ordinary business. And she stood on the pavement outside the department building and thought, "I did it." Not triumphantly, not with her arms raised. Just the quiet, certain arrival of a fact she had been working toward for 4 years and 2 months. A fact she had believed in on the days when the experiments failed and the data was wrong and the answer felt very far away. She went back inside and found Dr. Clark in his office. He looked up, cleaned his glasses, and said, "Well?" She said, "Minor corrections," he said, "Of course." And then, which was unusual for him, he smiled. She flew home to Jeddah in December 2004, with her doctorate and her notebooks, and the blueprints for a device that had not yet been manufactured, but existed, fully, in verified scientific form. She also carried something less physical but equally real. 4 years of learning not just science but endurance, not just research methodology, but the specific skill of remaining yourself under conditions that encourage you to become smaller. Home received her the way home always does, with the smell of her mother's cooking, and the noise of the neighborhood, and the particular quality of Saudi afternoon light that was different from every other kind of light in the world. Warmer and more direct, as though the sun here had less patience for subtlety. Her mother hugged her for a long time. Her father, who was a man of few words and large pride, stood in the doorway and nodded in a way that contained everything. She spent 3 months reconnecting with the country she had left and assessing the landscape she would be working in. The terms of her fellowship required her to pursue research relevant to national priorities, and she had honored this. Her work on diagnostics for infectious disease was as relevant to the national interest of Saudi Arabia as it was to the global need she had been working toward. But she also understood that relevance was not enough. She needed funding, institutional support, laboratory infrastructure, and the kind of professional credibility that would make it possible for her to pursue the larger ambition, getting the technology out of the laboratory and into the field. This was the second mountain, and it was, in some ways, harder than the first. The work of science happens in 2 phases. The first phase is the discovery, the years in the laboratory, the failed experiments, the breakthrough, the verified result. The second phase is the translation, the long, frustrating political work of turning the discovery into something that the world can actually use. Many brilliant discoveries never complete the second journey. They remain in journals, cited by other researchers, building towards something that never arrives. The gap between what science knows and what reaches a patient in a rural clinic is not a gap of knowledge. It is a gap of systems, funding, distribution, politics, and will. Hayat had spent 4 years on the first mountain. She was now standing at the base of the second one, and she could see that it was steeper and less well mapped, and that nobody had handed her a clear path to the top. She applied for research positions at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which was then in its development phase, and at several other institutions. She presented her work at conferences. She met with officials in the Ministry of Health who listened politely, and asked about timelines, and said the words "promising" and "further evaluation" in the particular combination that means nothing is going to happen soon. She was not discouraged. She had been in rooms before where the answer was no, and she had learned to hear the specific quality of no that was actually not yet. She kept moving. In 2006, she received an invitation to present her research at an international biotechnology conference in Geneva. She accepted. She stood in front of an audience of 300 scientists and health policy professionals from 37 countries, and she showed them, in plain language with clear slides, exactly what her technology could do and exactly why it mattered. The room went quiet while she spoke. Not the polite quiet of an audience being patient, the specific quiet of people who are recalibrating. After the talk, a man named Dr. Frederick Osei, a Ghanaian physician and public health researcher who worked with the World Health Organization, waited until the room had cleared, and then came over and introduced himself and said, "I have been waiting for this for 12 years. He was not speaking hyperbolically. He had been working in rural diagnostics for 12 years. He knew exactly what the absence of accessible diagnostic tools cost in human lives. He had data on it. He carried some of it in his head the way certain people carry certain weights. Not dramatically, but always. They talked for 2 hours. She flew home from Geneva with a new partnership, a new timeline, and the feeling, specific, physical, unmistakable, that the second mountain had a path on it after all. The device that came out of 3 more years of applied development and field testing was called a lab on a chip, though that name was used loosely in the industry for a range of technologies. What Hayat's version could do that others could not was the specific combination, accurate, stable, portable, cheap, and operable, without specialist training. It was the size of a credit card, thinner than most, made from materials that could be manufactured at scale. It required no electricity. It required no refrigeration for storage or transport. It could sit in a supply bag on the back of a motorbike, traveling a dirt road in 40-degree heat, and still produce reliable results when it arrived. A drop of blood, a saliva sample, a urine sample, 15 minutes, a result. The diseases it could detect in its first iteration were tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV. 3 of the leading causes of preventable death in low-income countries. 3 conditions where early accurate diagnosis changed outcomes dramatically. 3 conditions where the current diagnostic gap was costing hundreds of thousands of lives every year. Dr. Osei coordinated the first field trials in Ghana and Uganda. The trials ran through 2007 and 2008. The results were compared against laboratory gold standard diagnostics at regional hospitals. The accuracy rates were above 93% across all 3 conditions. The false negative rate, the rate at which the device missed a real infection, was below acceptable clinical thresholds. Hayat flew to Ghana for the second phase of the trials. She visited the clinic sites. She watched health workers use the device. She watched them show patients results. She watched a woman in a village in the eastern region of Ghana receive a tuberculosis diagnosis that she would not otherwise have had access to for months, if ever. And she watched the health worker explain the result and explain the treatment pathway, calmly and clearly, in a language that the woman understood. She stood outside the clinic afterward, in the courtyard, in the afternoon sun. She did not think about the ministry building in Jeddah. She did not think about the corridor or the ceiling tiles or the polished lath behind the door. Those things were in the past, which is where the past is supposed to be. She thought about the photograph she had kept above her monitor in Cambridge, the clinic in rural Pakistan, pinned there not as inspiration but as orientation. She thought about the weight of failure's cost, which she had carried for years in a way that had nothing to do with her own ambitions, and everything to do with the people she had never met, who needed the work to succeed. She got out her notebook. She wrote something in the lower right corner of the page. She closed it. When she returned to the institutional world, the conferences, the policy meetings, the academic appointments and the administrative rooms where decisions were made, she carried this with her, the specific knowledge of what the work was actually for. It was not for the journals. It was not for the fellowships, or the accolades, or the professional committees. It was for a woman in a courtyard in Ghana who now knew what was happening in her body and what could be done about it. That clarity is a specific kind of power. It does not make institutional obstacles disappear. It does not make committees faster or funding easier or political resistance less frustrating, but it gives you a unit of measurement that nothing external can falsify. You know what the work is worth because you have seen what the work does. She presented the field trial results at the World Health Organization headquarters in 2009. The room was different from the one in Geneva, more formal, more policy-weighted, more populated by people whose job was to think in systems and populations. She had learned by now how to speak in that room, not just as a scientist reporting results, but as a person who understood the system she was trying to change and the specific levers that moved it. The presentation lasted an hour. The discussion afterward lasted 2.5 more. There were hard questions about manufacturing scale, about regulatory pathways, about cost per unit at volume, about distribution infrastructure. She answered every question. The answers that she did not have, she said she did not have, and said what she intended to do about that. After the meeting, a senior WHO official told her, in the corridor, that her work represented the most significant advance in low-resource diagnostics in a decade. She thanked him. She found the nearest coffee and drank it standing up, thinking about the next problem. There was always a next problem. This was not discouraging. It was simply the nature of the work, and she had come to understand the work as something that did not end. Not because it was endless in a hopeless way, but because each solution opened a new and better problem. A problem that could only exist because you had solved the one before it. This was science. This was also, she had come to think, something larger. A way of existing in the world that treated every closed door as information about where the next open one might be. In 2012, Hayat Sindhi was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, one of the most prestigious scientific honors in the world. She was the first Saudi woman ever inducted. She was also, at the time of her induction, the youngest member by a margin that several press reports described as remarkable. She described it, when asked, as nothing. Not out of false modesty, out of a specific understanding of what the honor was and what it was not. It was recognition. Recognition was not nothing. Recognition had weight. It opened rooms. It gave you a platform you could use for the next argument you needed to make. But it was a record of past work, not a measurement of present worth, and she had been around long enough to know the difference. The year before her induction, she had co-founded the I2 Institute for Imagination and Ingenuity in Jeddah, an organization whose central purpose was to do for the next generation of scientists in Saudi Arabia and the broader Arab world what nobody had done for her: build a structure of support around young people, particularly young women, who had the intelligence and the drive but lacked the infrastructure and the belief that their work could matter on a global scale. The founding of I2 was not incidental to her scientific work. It was a direct extension of it. She had learned, in the 15 years between that corridor in Jeddah and the stages of Geneva and Washington, that scientific achievement in isolation was insufficient. The system that produced scientists, that identified them young, nurtured them, funded them, connected them, believed in them, was itself something that needed to be built. In Saudi Arabia in 2011, the infrastructure for that system, particularly for women, was still partial. There were universities, there were programs, there were individual teachers who understood what they had in front of them. But there was not yet, in a systematic way, the things she had needed and not found at 26. A room where someone in authority told you that your ambitions were not too large, that the problem you wanted to solve was worth solving, that the world needed what you were trying to build. She built that room. The I2 Institute ran workshops in schools and universities. It brought together young scientists from across the Arab world. It created mentoring structures, research incubation programs, connections to international institutions that could expand what was possible for a student who had never left their home country. It took the specific insight she had gathered in Cambridge and Geneva and Accra and Washington, that the only way the world's hardest problems got solved was by pulling in the widest possible range of minds, and tried to create the conditions for that. In the schools in Riyadh where she came to speak, girls sat in the front row. This was not remarkable to them. They were 14, 15, 16 years old, and the world they were growing up in was changing, and they sat in the front row because that was where the interesting things happened. They asked her questions that she was sometimes required to think hard to answer. They wanted to know not just what she had done, but how she had decided what to do, how she had known which problem was hers, how she had kept going when the work was not going well. She told them the truth. She told them that she had not always known, that she had gone into that ministry building in 2000, uncertain of a great many things, including whether the door would open at all. She told them about the 47 ceiling tiles and the conditional yes, and the voice she had heard behind the closing door. She told them that fear was not the opposite of courage, that courage was just what you called it when you did the thing you needed to do, while the fear was also present, and that the fear did not have to leave before you could move. She told them about the 9-hour day in October in the Cambridge laboratory, and about the moment when the noise in the data revealed its pattern, and about the woman in the courtyard in Ghana. She told them that the point of the work was never the awards or the titles or the rooms you were admitted to. The point was the courtyard, the place where the work touched an actual human life and changed something. The girls in the front row wrote things down. Some of them, she knew, would become scientists. Some of them would become doctors, engineers, economists, policymakers. Some of them would become things that did not yet have names, doing work that had not yet been defined, solving problems that had not yet been fully understood. The specific form did not matter. What mattered was the habit of mind, the one she was trying to plant, the idea that an impossible problem was an invitation, not a verdict. The diagnostic technology she had developed continued to expand. After the initial field trials in Ghana and Uganda, the platform moved through regulatory processes in multiple countries. Versions of the technology were adapted for additional infectious diseases, a process that was not fast, because no process that involves clinical accuracy and regulatory approval should be fast, but that moved steadily. By 2015, field deployable versions had been deployed in partnership programs across 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The numbers involved were not abstract. Hundreds of thousands of tests, diagnoses that would not otherwise have been made, treatment pathways accessed by patients who would otherwise have remained undiagnosed until the disease had progressed to the point where treatment was harder and outcomes were worse. These numbers existed in reports. Hayat read the reports. But the number she returned to, the one she could not reduce to a statistic, was always the same one. A woman, a courtyard, a result, a changed situation. The irreducible individual instance of the work doing what the work was supposed to do. She was appointed a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for Science in 2012, in recognition of her work on accessible diagnostics and her advocacy for science education across the developing world. The appointment gave her a wider platform and a set of relationships with governments and international organizations that she used with the practical directness she brought to everything. Here is what the science shows. Here is what the gap costs. Here is what a targeted investment in diagnostic infrastructure produces in outcomes. She was not ideological about it. She was empirical. The data was very clear. The question was always whether the people with the authority to act were prepared to follow where the data led. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they were not. She continued regardless. In an interview she gave in 2013 to a magazine in London, a journalist asked her what she thought about the fact that she had become a symbol for women in science across the Arab world and beyond. She paused before answering. The pause was not hesitation. It was the specific consideration she gave to questions that deserved to be taken seriously. She said that she was not sure she was comfortable with the word symbol, because a symbol could be admired at a distance without any change in behavior, and what she wanted was not admiration but replication. Other women in other laboratories solving other impossible problems, not because she had done it, but because the conditions existed for them to try. The journalist wrote down every word. She still had the notebook from Cambridge. The black cover, the plain pages, the page from October in the 4th year, covered in calculations and arrows and the small phrase in the lower right corner, "This is it." The notebook now lived in a drawer in her home in Jeddah, alongside the others. The journals of field observations from Ghana and Uganda, the drafts of the I2 curriculum, the notes from 100 meetings and 10,000 small decisions that had accumulated into something she had not fully planned, but could look back on and recognize as a life shaped by a particular kind of intention. She had not planned to become a symbol. She had planned to solve a problem. The problem had led to another problem, and then another. And each one had required the same things: clarity about what mattered, endurance in the face of the obstacles between the starting point and the answer, and the specific kind of faith, not religious, though she had that too, but epistemic, that the answer existed and was findable by someone willing to look long enough. She had been willing to look long enough. She was still willing. The 47 ceiling tiles were not a memory she revisited for pain. They were a reference point, a coordinate in her own history, a way of saying to herself, I was that person, sitting in that chair, in that corridor, and I did not stop moving. That is not an achievement. That is simply what happened. But it is important to know that it happened. To know that the person who sat in that chair and counted the tiles and listened to the laugh behind the door was the same person who stood in a courtyard in Ghana and wrote, "This is it," in a notebook and said nothing to anyone that night, just walked home along the river in the dark, and went to sleep and got up the next morning and continued. Continuing is not dramatic. It has no music. It does not look like courage when you are doing it. It looks like showing up again, one more time, in a laboratory or a conference room or a school in Riyadh, with girls in the front row, and doing the next thing that needs to be done. She got up every morning and did the next thing. She had not stopped yet. She did not intend to.